Welcome, dear listeners, to another story from Silent Tears. I am your narrator, and today we embark on a journey that will take us deep into the heart of family, loyalty, and the surprising ways that love can hide in the most unexpected places. This is a story that unfolded in the autumn of 2024, in a grand estate that had witnessed 3 generations of triumph and heartbreak, of dreams built and dreams shattered. Today we explore the tale of Charles Whitmore, a man who spent 78 years building an empire, but discovered only in his final months what truly mattered. It's the story of Elena Rodriguez, whose quiet devotion would change everything she touched, though she never sought recognition or reward. And it's the story of a will that would shatter every assumption, destroy every expectation, and ultimately rebuild a family from the ground up in ways no one could have imagined. As we settle in together for this 3-hour journey, I invite you to open your hearts to a story about inheritance, not just of money, but of love, character, and the profound impact that one person's recognition can have on another's life. This is a story about what happens when someone finally sees the invisible among us and chooses to honor their service in a way that transforms not just their life, but the lives of everyone around them. So pour yourself a warm cup of tea, find your most comfortable chair, and join me as we discover together how one man's final decision would teach an entire family the difference between wealth and riches, between entitlement and gratitude, between what we expect from life and what life sometimes gives us instead. This is The Will That Changed Everything. Chapter 1. The Gathering. In the hushed atmosphere of the oak-paneled study, the Whitmore family assembled like mourners at a funeral, though Charles Whitmore had been dead for 3 weeks already. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco still lingered in the air, as if the patriarch's presence refused to leave the room where he had spent his final years. The afternoon light filtered through heavy burgundy curtains, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet that had been a wedding gift from Charles's first major client 40 years ago. Every surface in the room spoke of success and tradition. The mahogany desk that had belonged to Charles's father, the crystal decanter that held scotch older than some of the people in the room, the oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to watch the proceedings with disapproving eyes. Margaret Whitmore Davis adjusted her pearl necklace nervously, the 3 strands clicking together with a sound like tiny bones. Her perfectly manicured fingers betrayed the anxiety she tried so hard to conceal, drumming against her Hermes handbag in a rhythm that matched her racing heartbeat. She had dressed for this occasion as if it were a board meeting at one of her charities. Navy blue suit, sensible pumps, hair pulled back in a chignon that had been her signature style for 20 years. But beneath the composed exterior, Margaret felt like a child again, waiting to see if she had pleased or disappointed the father, who had never quite seemed satisfied with her accomplishments. The weight of expectation pressed down on Margaret like a physical force, reminding her of all the times she had sat in this very room as a child, watching her father conduct business with the serious men who came to discuss contracts and deals. She had always been fascinated by these meetings, drawn to the complexity of the negotiations and the satisfaction that seemed to light up her father's face when he closed a particularly challenging deal. As a young girl, she had imagined herself someday sitting across from Charles at that massive desk, contributing her own ideas to the family business, earning his respect through her intelligence and determination. Those dreams had faded slowly, worn away by years of subtle dismissals and redirected ambitions. Margaret had channeled her considerable talents into charitable work, becoming one of the most effective fundraisers in the city, organizing galas that raised millions for various causes. She had served on numerous boards, chaired committees, and earned recognition from the mayor for her civic contributions. But none of it had ever seemed to impress her father the way Thomas's business achievements did. None of it had earned her the kind of pride and attention she had craved since childhood. Now, at 54, Margaret found herself hoping that Charles's final judgment would somehow validate all those years of service, would recognize the worth of her contributions, even if they hadn't been made directly to the family business. She had maintained the family's reputation in the community, had used the Whitmore name to do genuine good in the world, had raised a daughter who was intelligent and accomplished in her own right. Surely that counted for something in the final accounting of worth and inheritance. Beside her, her brother Thomas paced near the mahogany bookshelf, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the hardwood floor with increasing agitation. The sound echoed through the study like a metronome, marking time until the moment that would define the rest of his life. Thomas had always been a pacer, even as a child, wearing paths in the carpet of his bedroom while he worried about tests or games or whether his father would notice his latest achievement. Now, at 51, he still moved like a man trying to outrun his own anxiety, his tall frame coiled with the nervous energy that had driven him to success in the family business. Chapter 2. Old Rivalries. The tension in the room had roots that stretched back decades, invisible threads of resentment and competition that bound the family together as surely as blood, but far less comfortably. To understand what was about to unfold in that study, one had to understand the complex web of relationships that had been woven over more than half a century of family life, the small wounds that had never healed, the disappointed hopes that had hardened into lasting grievances, and the unspoken competition that had defined the Whitmore children's entire adult lives. Margaret, the eldest at 54, had never forgiven her father for what she saw as his favoritism toward Thomas during their childhood. She could still remember, with the crystal clarity that pain sometimes brings, the afternoon when she was 12 and had brought home a report card filled with A's, excited to share her achievement with the father she adored. Charles had glanced at the paper, nodded approvingly, and then turned his attention back to 8-year-old Thomas, who was building something elaborate with his construction toys in the corner of the study. "That's my boy," Charles had said, ruffling Thomas's hair. "Going to build the whole world someday, aren't you?" Margaret had stood there holding her perfect report card, feeling invisible and unimportant, wondering what she had to do to earn the same kind of pride and attention. The pattern had continued throughout their childhood and into their adult years. When Margaret graduated summa cum laude from Vassar with a degree in art history, Charles had attended the ceremony but spent most of the reception talking business with other parents. When Thomas graduated from business school, Charles had thrown him a party at the country club and announced to everyone present that his son was joining the family company. Margaret had watched from the sidelines, her own considerable intelligence dismissed as somehow less valuable because it wasn't focused on the family business. She remembered every slight, every time their father had praised Thomas's business acumen, while dismissing her own ideas as merely feminine intuition or interesting suggestions. When she had proposed expanding into residential real estate development, Charles had listened politely and then assigned the project to Thomas. When she had suggested establishing a charitable foundation to improve the company's public image, Charles had agreed it was a good idea and then asked Thomas to implement it. Year after year, decade after decade, Margaret had watched her contributions minimized and her brothers elevated, until she had finally given up trying to compete and had channeled her energies into her own charitable work and social activities. The irony was that Margaret's suggestions had often been brilliant, her strategic thinking sound, her understanding of market dynamics sophisticated and nuanced. But Charles had been a man of his generation, unable to imagine his daughter as a true business partner, seeing her intelligence as admirable but ultimately ornamental. He had loved Margaret deeply, but he had loved her as a daughter, to be protected rather than as a mind to be engaged, and this fundamental misunderstanding had poisoned their relationship for decades. Chapter 3. The Confident Son. Thomas Whitmore stood with the bearing of a man who had never truly doubted his place in the world, despite the undercurrents of family tension that swirled around him like an invisible tide. At 51, he possessed the kind of quiet authority that came from decades of making difficult decisions, of bearing responsibility for outcomes that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. His tall frame carried the weight of expectation with practiced ease, his shoulders squared against the burden of being the chosen heir to an empire that had taken 3 generations to build. He had spent the last 25 years proving himself worthy of his father's legacy, working 16-hour days when necessary, making the difficult decisions that others avoided, expanding the business into new markets, while his sisters pursued what he saw as hobbies and diversions. Margaret had married well and devoted herself to charity work, organizing galas and serving on boards that provided social prestige, but generated no measurable economic value. Elizabeth had dabbled in art and traveled the world on their father's generosity, pursuing passions that were beautiful, but ultimately inconsequential to the serious business of building and maintaining wealth. But Thomas had stayed. Thomas had fought. Thomas had earned his place at their father's side through sheer dedication and sacrifice, through the kind of unwavering commitment that separated true leaders from mere inheritors of privilege. He knew every detail of Whitmore Holdings, with the intimacy that came from living and breathing the business for more than 2 decades. Every investment, every property, every debt and asset that comprised the family fortune was as familiar to him as the rooms of his own house. More than that, he understood his father's vision, the careful strategies that had built a regional construction company into a multi-million-dollar conglomerate. The business had been Charles's life work, but it would be Thomas's legacy. Father and son had spent countless hours in this very study, planning the next generation of growth and expansion, identifying new markets and opportunities, discussing the challenges and risks that lay ahead. Charles had been a demanding teacher, never accepting mediocrity, always pushing for excellence. But he had also been generous with his knowledge and experience. Thomas had learned not just the mechanics of construction and development, but the subtler arts of negotiation and relationship building, the importance of reputation and reliability in an industry built on trust. The cost of this dedication had been enormous, but Thomas had paid it willingly, seeing each sacrifice as an investment in his future and his family's legacy. His marriage to Jennifer had been one of the casualties, a relationship that had withered under the demands of his 80-hour work weeks and constant travel. Jennifer had tried to be understanding at first, had supported his ambition, and shared his vision of their future together. But as the years passed and Thomas's absences grew longer and more frequent, she had begun to feel like a widow married to a ghost. Chapter 4. The Lawyer's Pause. Harold Pemberton had been practicing law for 43 years, and in that time he had read thousands of wills to grieving families, witnessed every possible combination of human emotion that money and death could produce. He had seen grown children weep with gratitude at unexpected bequests, rage with fury, at perceived slights, and collapse with shock at revelations that destroyed their understanding of the deceased. He had navigated family feuds and bitter disputes, had mediated between siblings who could no longer speak to each other, had watched inheritance tear families apart and occasionally bring them together in ways that life had never managed to achieve. But in all his years of legal practice, Harold had never sat with a family while carrying the weight of knowledge that pressed down on him now like a physical burden. The manila envelope resting beneath his weathered hands contained more than just a legal document. It held the power to transform lives, to challenge assumptions, to force a reckoning with truths that this family had spent decades avoiding. Harold had read the will multiple times since Charles's death, had studied every clause and provision, had consulted with colleagues about potential legal challenges, but he still felt unprepared for the moment when these carefully crafted words would be spoken aloud. Charles Whitmore had been more than just a client to Harold. They had been friends since college, roommates who had maintained their connection through marriage and divorce, children and grandchildren, business success, and personal tragedy. Harold had been present for every major decision in Charles's life, had drafted the contracts for his first big construction job, had handled his divorce when Charles's wife Sarah had left him for a younger man, taking half his assets and most of his confidence in the process. He had witnessed the bitter custody battles that followed, had seen Charles fight for the right to maintain meaningful relationships with his children, despite Sarah's efforts to poison them against their father. Those early struggles had shaped Charles in fundamental ways, had taught him lessons about loyalty and betrayal, about the difference between love and manipulation, between genuine care and calculated self-interest. Harold had watched his friend emerge from the wreckage of his marriage, stronger but also more cautious, more observant of people's motivations, more sensitive to the ways that wealth could corrupt relationships and distort natural affection. Over the years, Harold had served not just as Charles's legal counsel, but as his confidant and advisor, the one person who could speak frankly about sensitive matters without fear of judgment or betrayal. They had shared countless conversations about business strategy and family dynamics, about the challenges of raising children who had never known real hardship, about the burden of trying to teach values to people who had never been forced to develop them through struggle. Chapter 5. The First Words. Harold Pemberton's voice carried the weight of decades as he broke the wax seal with deliberate care, the red fragments falling onto the dark wood like drops of blood, each piece carrying its own finality. The room fell into absolute silence, even the grandfather clock seeming to hold its breath as the lawyer unfolded the crisp legal documents that would reshape the Whitmore family forever. The papers crackled slightly in the still air, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense quiet of the study. Thomas leaned forward slightly, his confidence manifesting in the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth. The expression of a man who had waited 25 years for this moment and was finally about to receive validation of everything he had sacrificed and achieved. His hands rested calmly on his knees, his posture relaxed despite the tension in the room, the bearing of someone who had no doubt about what the next few minutes would reveal. Margaret clasped her hands so tightly that her knuckles showed white against her pale skin, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her palms as she tried to control the anxiety that threatened to overwhelm her composure. She had spent the morning rehearsing gracious acceptance of whatever her father had decided to leave her, had prepared herself to be grateful for any acknowledgement of her worth. But the magnitude of the moment was larger than any preparation could have anticipated. Harold cleared his throat and began to read in the formal tone he had perfected over years of practice, his voice carrying clearly through the study, despite its gentle volume. Each word was pronounced with careful precision, as if he understood that every syllable carried weight and consequence, that the slightest misemphasis could change meanings and implications in ways that would reverberate for years. I, Charles Edmund Whitmore, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my last will and testament on this 14th day of March, 2024. I have lived a long life, built a successful business, and raised 3 children who have brought me both joy and disappointment in equal measure. But as I face my final days, I find myself thinking not of grand gestures or public recognition, but of quiet kindness and unwavering loyalty. I have come to understand that blood does not always determine family, and that love is often found in the most unexpected places. Therefore, I leave my worldly possessions not to those who expect them, but to those who have earned them through years of selfless devotion. Thomas's smile faded as the words registered, replaced by a growing confusion that would soon transform into something much more dangerous. The will that he had assumed would validate his life's work was beginning to reveal an entirely different vision of worth and inheritance. Chapter 6. The Father's Memories. Charles Whitmore had been a man who collected memories like other people collected books or art, storing them carefully in the corners of his mind, where they could be retrieved and examined during the quiet moments of his later years. Unlike photographs or written records, these mental treasures were infused with emotion and context, colored by the wisdom that came from decades of living and observing, enriched by the understanding that only accumulated experience could provide. As Harold's voice continued reading the will, the document itself became a window into these preserved moments, revealing the careful observations of a man who had watched his family with the same analytical eye that had made him successful in business. The will was more than just a legal instrument. It was Charles's final commentary on the people he had loved most, a summation of decades of watching and learning, of hoping and being disappointed, of trying to understand what had gone wrong and how it might be corrected. Each provision reflected not just current circumstances, but the entire history of relationships that had shaped and been shaped by the accumulation of wealth and the exercise of power. Charles had seen Margaret's increasing bitterness over the years, had watched as disappointment curdled into resentment and poisoned her capacity for joy and gratitude. He remembered the 12-year-old girl who had brought him her perfect report card with such pride and excitement, remembered how her face had fallen when his attention was diverted to Thomas's construction project. But he also remembered the 40-year-old woman who had interrupted his hospitalization to complain about the inconvenience his illness was causing her social schedule, who had seemed more concerned with the disruption to her charity gala than with his recovery and health. The transformation had been gradual but unmistakable. The bright, eager child had become an accomplished but bitter adult, successful in her own sphere but poisoned by decades of perceived slights and unmet expectations. Margaret had achieved remarkable things. Her charitable work had genuinely helped thousands of people. Her fundraising events had generated millions for worthy causes. Her leadership had advanced important civic projects. But Charles had watched as these achievements became overshadowed by resentment about opportunities denied, about recognition withheld, about what she saw as her father's failure to appreciate her worth. Thomas presented a different kind of disappointment, perhaps even more painful because it was so unexpected. Charles had invested everything in his son's development as a leader and successor, had shared his knowledge and experience generously, had created opportunities for Thomas to prove himself and grow into his responsibilities. By any objective measure, Thomas had exceeded expectations. The company was more successful under his leadership than it had ever been under Charles's direct management, more efficient, more profitable, more responsive to changing market conditions. But Charles had watched his son sacrifice his humanity on the altar of ambition, had seen Thomas become so focused on inheriting the business that he had forgotten why the business existed in the first place. The young man who had played with construction toys and dreamed of building the world had become a middle-aged executive who saw everything in terms of profit margins and market share, who treated employees as resources to be managed rather than people to be respected, who had lost his marriage and his relationship with his son in pursuit of goals that had ultimately proved hollow. Chapter 7. The Maid's Silent Sacrifice. Elena Rodriguez had been 23 years old when she first walked through the front door of the Whitmore estate. Her English still uncertain, her hands still soft from a previous life that seemed like someone else's dream, her heart heavy with the weight of circumstances that had brought her to this moment of desperate necessity. She had come to America with her husband Carlos and their infant daughter Maria, following promises of a better life that had dissolved like morning mist when Carlos disappeared one night, leaving behind only debts and broken dreams, and a young woman who suddenly found herself alone in a foreign country with a child to support and no clear path forward. The job with the Whitmore family had been her salvation in the most literal sense, a steady income that allowed her to provide for Maria while gradually building the skills and confidence she needed to navigate her new country. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had been the Whitmores' previous housekeeper, had recommended Elena for the position before retiring to live with her daughter in Florida. The recommendation had been based on only a brief acquaintance, but Mrs. Patterson had recognized something in Elena's quiet demeanor and careful attention to detail that suggested she would be suitable for the demanding work of maintaining a household of the Whitmores' size and standards. Elena had accepted the position with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation, understanding that this opportunity represented not just employment, but the difference between survival and failure, between being able to keep Maria with her and being forced to make impossible choices about their future. The salary was modest but adequate, the working conditions were demanding but not unreasonable, and the family that seemed decent enough in their initial interactions, though she sensed undercurrents of tension and competition that she didn't fully understand. For 27 years, Elena had moved through the Whitmore house like a ghost, cleaning and cooking and organizing with an efficiency that made her nearly invisible to the family she served. This invisibility had been partly intentional. She had learned early that the best domestic employees were those who could anticipate needs without being obtrusive, who could maintain households without disrupting the rhythms of family life. But the invisibility had also been cultural and social, the natural result of class differences and language barriers that made meaningful interaction difficult, even when it was desired. Elena had been present for every major event in the Whitmore family's life during her tenure: birthdays and holidays, graduations and weddings, business successes and personal crises. She had decorated Christmas trees and prepared holiday meals, had cleaned up after parties and organized family celebrations, had witnessed arguments and reconciliations, triumphs and disappointments. But she had experienced all of these events from the periphery, as a facilitator rather than a participant, as someone whose job was to enable others' happiness rather than to share in it. But Elena's greatest service had been to Charles himself during his final years, as she gradually transitioned from household employee to something approaching a daughter in everything but name and legal recognition. The transformation had been so gradual that neither of them had fully acknowledged it while it was happening. But Charles had come to depend on Elena's presence and support in ways that went far beyond her official duties and responsibilities. Elena had been the one to notice when Charles began forgetting names and dates, when his usually sharp memory started showing the first signs of decline. Rather than reporting these incidents to family members who might have panicked or overreacted, Elena had quietly adapted her approach to providing support, gently reminding Charles of appointments and obligations, discreetly helping him maintain his dignity and independence as his capacities slowly diminished. Chapter 8. The Shock. Harold Pemberton's voice seemed to echo from a great distance as he continued reading the will that was systematically destroying every assumption the Whitmore family had held sacred for decades. The formal language of legal documents felt inadequate to contain the emotional earthquake that was building with each carefully crafted phrase, each precisely chosen word that revealed Charles's final judgment on the people who had defined his life for more than half a century. To Margaret, Thomas, and Elizabeth, my beloved children, I leave the sum of $50,000 each, along with specific personal items detailed in the attached inventory. I hope that this modest inheritance will encourage you to find value in yourselves rather than in my accumulated wealth. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of confusion and disbelief that spread outward from the center of comprehension to the furthest reaches of possibility. The pause that followed these words stretched like a held breath, the silence so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like hammer blows against the stunned quiet of the study. Time seemed suspended, as if the universe itself was waiting to see how the Whitmore family would process information that challenged everything they had believed about their father's love, their own worth, and the future that had seemed so certain just moments before. Thomas felt his world tilt on its axis, the familiar study seeming to shift and blur around him as his mind struggled to process what he had just heard. $50,000. After 25 years of 16-hour days, after sacrificing his marriage and his relationship with his son, after giving his entire adult life to the family business and his father's vision, Charles had valued his contribution at $50,000. The number felt like a physical blow, a repudiation so complete and unexpected that Thomas couldn't immediately find words or thoughts to respond to it. Margaret's face had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup suddenly looking like a mask painted on porcelain, her lips moving soundlessly, as if she were trying to speak, but had forgotten how words worked. The sum that Harold had just announced was less than she typically spent on a single charity gala, less than her annual clothing budget, less than the cost of the jewelry she was wearing at this very moment. It was not an inheritance, but an insult. Not recognition, but rejection. Not love, but a public declaration that her father had found her unworthy of the legacy she had spent a lifetime expecting to receive. Elizabeth sat frozen in her mother's chair, her hands gripping the velvet armrests, with a force that seemed to be the only thing keeping her upright in a world that had suddenly lost all familiar reference points. She had never expected to inherit the bulk of her father's estate. That honor had clearly been reserved for Thomas, but she had assumed that her portion would be substantial enough to provide security and independence to fund the artistic and cultural pursuits that had defined her adult life. Harold continued reading, his professional demeanor intact despite the emotional earthquake he was witnessing. To my grandchildren, Sarah and Michael, I leave trust funds of $100,000 each, to be accessed when they reach the age of 30, along with my hope that they will use this time to discover who they are beyond their last name. Chapter 9. The silence. The silence that settled over the study was unlike anything the room had ever contained. A profound quiet that seemed to absorb sound and meaning until even breathing became a conscious effort that required deliberate attention and control. It was the silence of a world turned upside down, of certainties crumbling like sandcastles before an unexpected tide, of comfortable assumptions dissolving into nothingness under the weight of reality that no one had prepared for or imagined possible. This was not the expectant quiet that had preceded Harold's reading. When the family had gathered with anticipation and anxiety, but still within the bounds of recognizable possibility, this was something entirely different. The stunned stillness that follows catastrophic revelation, when the mind struggles to process information that doesn't fit existing frameworks of understanding, when familiar patterns are suddenly disrupted and new realities must somehow be integrated into consciousness that resists such fundamental change. Thomas stood frozen by the bookshelf, his mouth slightly open as if he were about to speak, but had forgotten what words he intended to use, his mind racing through calculations and possibilities that all led to the same impossible conclusion. His entire identity had been built around his role as heir apparent to the Whitmore legacy, the chosen successor who had been groomed for leadership and responsibility since childhood. Every major decision of his adult life had been made with that future in mind. Every sacrifice had been justified by the certainty that he was building something larger than himself, something that would justify the costs and validate the choices. Margaret remained rigid in her chair, her face a mask of disbelief and growing horror as the implications of what she had heard began to penetrate the protective shell of shock that had initially insulated her from the full impact of her father's rejection. She had spent 54 years as Charles Whitmore's daughter, defining herself through that relationship, building her social standing and personal identity on the assumption that she would one day inherit a significant portion of his wealth and carry forward his legacy in her own way. Elizabeth felt as if she were watching the scene from a great distance, as if she had somehow become separated from her own body and was observing the destruction of her family from outside herself, protected by a kind of emotional numbness that made the events seem unreal and dreamlike. The room seemed to pulse with unspoken questions and growing dread, each person trapped in their own private universe of confusion and fear, struggling to find some explanation that would make sense of the impossible. Even Harold Pemberton felt the weight of the silence, 43 years of legal practice having taught him to recognize the difference between normal family tension and the kind of seismic shift that could tear relationships apart forever. He knew that what came next would determine whether the Whitmore family could survive this revelation intact, whether the bonds that had held them together, however imperfectly, could withstand the pressure of such fundamental disappointment and betrayal. Chapter 10. The Hidden Envelope. As Harold prepared to continue reading, his fingers encountered something unexpected within the folds of the will. A second envelope, smaller and more personal than the official legal documents, sealed with the same red wax, but bearing a different kind of weight and significance. This envelope was addressed in Charles's distinctive handwriting, the elegant script that had signed countless contracts and business correspondence over the decades, but now employed for a more intimate purpose. The words, "My True Family," were written across the front in letters that seemed to shimmer with meaning in the amber light of the desk lamp. Harold had known of this envelope's existence, had been present when Charles sealed it with trembling fingers just weeks before his death. But seeing it now in the context of the devastated faces around him filled him with a deep sense of foreboding that went beyond his general anxiety about the afternoon's proceedings. The old man had insisted that this personal letter be read aloud, with the will, despite Harold's gentle suggestion that private communications might be better delivered separately, away from the raw emotions and potential legal complications that such public reading might create. Charles had been adamant about this point. his eyes bright with a clarity that had been increasingly rare in his final months, his voice carrying a strength that his frail body seemed incapable of supporting. "They need to understand, Harold," he had said, gripping the lawyer's arm with surprising force. "They need to know why I'm making these choices, what I've seen and learned over all these years. If I don't explain it now, they'll spend the rest of their lives thinking I was cruel or crazy, and they'll never learn the lessons I'm trying to teach them." The family watched Harold with a mixture of desperate hope and growing dread, each person clinging to the possibility that this second envelope might somehow restore their shattered expectations, might contain an explanation that would make sense of the incomprehensible distribution of assets they had just heard. Perhaps Charles had been playing an elaborate game, testing their reactions before revealing his real intentions. Perhaps there were additional codicils or amendments that would restore the inheritance they had expected. Perhaps the bulk of the estate was detailed in this personal letter, distributed according to criteria that would make more sense once they understood their father's reasoning. The envelope seemed to glow with promise and threat in equal measure, holding within its confines the explanation that might make sense of this incomprehensible turn of events, or might make everything infinitely worse by revealing the depth of Charles's disappointment in the family he had loved and supported for decades. Chapter 11. The Son's Fury. The silence shattered like crystal as Thomas finally found his voice, his words exploding into the study with a violence that made everyone except Harold flinch backward in their chairs, as if they were trying to escape the blast radius of emotions that had been building pressure like steam in a boiler until they could no longer be contained. "This is insane!" Thomas roared, his voice carrying a rage so raw and desperate that it seemed to strip away 25 years of professional polish and reveal the hurt child beneath the successful businessman's exterior. 25 years I've given to this company, 25 years of my life, and he leaves me pocket change like I'm some distant relative he barely knew. Thomas's face had flushed a dangerous red, his carefully controlled businessman's demeanor cracking, like a facade that could no longer support the weight of his fury and disappointment. The man who had spent decades cultivating an image of calm competence, who had prided himself on never losing control, even in the most stressful negotiations, was now completely unmoored, his composure shattered by the magnitude of what he saw as his father's ultimate betrayal. "I know every aspect of this business better than he did in his final years," Thomas continued, his voice rising with each word as 25 years of suppressed resentment and unacknowledged doubt suddenly found expression in this moment of ultimate crisis. "I've been running Whitmore Holdings for the last decade, while he sat in this study playing with his memories and his regrets, second-guessing every decision I made and questioning every strategy I developed. I turned this company into something bigger and more successful than he ever imagined, and this is how he rewards my loyalty and dedication." "I'll contest this, Will," Thomas declared, his business training finally reasserting itself as he began to channel his rage into strategic thinking about legal alternatives and procedural challenges. No judge in the state would uphold something this obviously written under duress or diminished capacity. Dad wasn't thinking clearly in his final months. Everyone knows that. He was confused, probably manipulated by someone who saw an opportunity to take advantage of an old man's weakness and vulnerability. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon, unspoken but understood by everyone in the room, carrying implications that would poison relationships and destroy trust in ways that might never be repaired. Chapter 12. The Granddaughter's Memory. Sarah Whitmore Collins sat quietly on the burgundy settee, her 26-year-old mind racing backward through Memories that suddenly seemed illuminated by an entirely different light, as if someone had changed the filters on a photograph and revealed details that had always been present but never properly seen or understood. Unlike her Uncle Thomas, whose fury was consuming the room like a wildfire, or her mother, Margaret, whose shock had rendered her nearly catatonic with rage and disbelief, Sarah found herself thinking about the small moments she had witnessed over the years, details that had seemed insignificant at the time but now formed a pattern she was only beginning to comprehend. She remembered the way her grandfather's face had softened whenever Elena Rodriguez entered the room. Not with the casual acknowledgement one might give to household staff, but with something approaching genuine affection and gratitude. It wasn't the patronizing appreciation that wealthy people sometimes showed toward their employees, but rather the kind of warmth that passed between people who genuinely cared about each other's well-being and happiness. More specifically, Sarah had noticed how Charles always asked Elena about her daughter Maria, remembering details about the girl's progress in nursing school, her struggles with organic chemistry, her plans for specializing in pediatric care. These conversations had seemed like simple politeness to Sarah at the time, the kind of personal interest that good employers showed in their workers' families. But now she wondered if there had been something deeper at work, a genuine investment in Maria's success that went beyond mere courtesy. She recalled the afternoon last Christmas when she had arrived early for dinner and found her grandfather and Elena sitting together in the kitchen, looking through old photographs and laughing quietly at some shared memory. The scene had struck Sarah as oddly intimate, not in any inappropriate way, but in the manner of two people who had developed genuine friendship and mutual respect over many years of daily interaction. As her Uncle Thomas continued his angry tirade about legal challenges and undue influence, Sarah found herself remembering her grandfather's words from their last real conversation just a month before his death. "Sarah," he had said, his voice weak but his eyes bright with purpose. "Remember that the most important things in life aren't always the most obvious ones." Chapter 13. Letters of the Past. Harold Pemberton's hands trembled slightly as he opened the second envelope, revealing not just a personal letter, but a collection of documents that would provide context for Charles Whitmore's shocking final decision. Papers that told a story spanning more than 2 decades and revealing depths of relationship that none of the Whitmore children had ever suspected or understood. The papers were yellowed with age, some of them dating back more than 20 years, and they chronicled a history of small moments and quiet interactions that had apparently meant more to Charles than any of his family had ever realized. The first document was a medical report from 1998, crisp hospital stationery bearing the letterhead of St. Mary's Medical Center, detailing Charles's hospitalization following a severe heart attack that had occurred while he was working late at the construction site of what would become his largest commercial project. According to the emergency room physician's notes, Charles had been found unconscious in the construction trailer at approximately 9:30 p.m. by a cleaning woman who had stayed late that evening to complete her work before the weekend. The woman had immediately called 911 and had administered basic first aid while waiting for paramedics to arrive, actions that the attending physician noted had likely prevented more serious complications and possibly saved Charles's life. The cleaning woman's name was listed in the report as Elena Rodriguez. The second document was even more revealing. A handwritten note from Elena to Charles, written in careful English on simple notebook paper and dated just a few days after his heart attack. "Mr. Whitmore," the note began, "I am glad you are feeling better. I hope your recovery continues and that you will soon be back to your normal activities and responsibilities. I wanted to tell you that your family loves you very much, even when they are worried and scared. Sometimes people say angry things when they are afraid of losing someone they care about. I hope you will forgive them and remember that they need you, even when they have trouble showing their feelings in the right way." Harold paused in his reading, watching as the family absorbed this glimpse into Elena's perception of their behavior during Charles's hospitalization. The note continued, revealing insights that were both gentle and profound. Observations that suggested Elena had understood the family's dynamics better than they had understood them themselves. "I know it is not my place to say these things, but I have watched your family for many years, and I see how much you all care for each other, even when you forget to show it in the best way. Families are complicated, and successful people sometimes have trouble expressing their deepest feelings. But I can see the love underneath the worry and the arguing. I will pray for your health and for peace in your house." The simple dignity of these words, written by someone who could have had no expectation of recognition or reward, seemed to fill the study with a different kind of presence entirely. Elena had not just saved Charles's life through her emergency response. She had also provided emotional wisdom and spiritual comfort during his recovery, helping him to see his family's behavior in a more generous and understanding light. Chapter 14. The Lawyer's Burden. Harold Pemberton had carried the weight of Charles Whitmore's final decision for months. And now, as he watched the family struggle to understand the magnitude of what was happening, he felt the full burden of his role in this transformation pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. As Charles's friend and legal advisor for more than 3 decades, Harold had been present for countless conversations over the past 2 years as the old man wrestled with questions of legacy and worth, family and loyalty, love and disappointment that had no easy answers or comfortable resolutions. The burden had begun to accumulate during Charles's recovery from his second heart attack. When Harold had sat in this very study listening, as Charles described his growing awareness of who had truly been there for him during his darkest moments, who had provided care and comfort without expectation of reward or recognition. The conversations had initially been tentative, Charles testing ideas and exploring possibilities without committing to any particular course of action. But they had gradually evolved into something more determined and decisive. "Harold," Charles had said during one of those late-night discussions, his voice still weak from his recent hospitalization, but his resolve crystal clear. "I've spent my whole life building something to leave behind, but I never stopped to think about who deserved to receive it. I assumed it would be my children because they carry my name. But names don't mean anything if they're not attached to character and values that justify the inheritance." Harold had tried to counsel his friend toward a more moderate approach, suggesting that perhaps Charles could provide for Elena generously while still leaving the bulk of his estate to his children, maintaining family harmony while still acknowledging Elena's exceptional service and character. But Charles had been unmovable on this point, his businessman's instincts telling him that half measures would satisfy no one and help nothing. "If I leave them millions without requiring them to earn it, they'll spend it and learn nothing about the values I tried to teach them," he had argued. "If I leave Elena a token amount, it insults everything she's given me and fails to provide the security and recognition she deserves." Now Harold faced the impossible task of executing his friend's final wishes while watching those wishes potentially destroy the very family Charles had hoped to redeem and educate. The legal challenges that Thomas was already threatening would be substantial and nasty, involving claims of diminished capacity, allegations of undue influence, demands for medical records and psychological evaluations. Harold had made a promise to his oldest friend, had given his word that he would see this through, regardless of the personal and professional cost, and Harold Pemberton was not a man who broke his promises. Chapter 15. The Maid's Dilemma. Elena Rodriguez stood in the kitchen of the Whitmore estate, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had grown cold as she listened to the muffled sounds of conflict coming from the study down the hall. Voices raised in anger and accusation that carried through the old house's thin walls like the rumble of distant thunder. She had been deliberately excluded from the will reading, Harold Pemberton having suggested that her presence might make an already difficult situation even more volatile. But the exclusion had done nothing to protect her from the emotional impact of what was unfolding. Elena's mind was a whirlwind of confliction and fear, because unlike the Whitmore family, she had known about the will's contents for weeks. Charles had told her about his decision during one of their quiet conversations in his final month, his eyes bright with a certainty that had both thrilled and terrified her. "Elena," he had said, taking her work-weathered hands in his own trembling fingers, "you've been more of a daughter to me than my own daughters, more loyal than my son, more loving than any of them have been in years. I want you to have what I've built, because you're the only one who understands what it really means." Elena had protested, of course, her instinctive humility and deep respect for family hierarchy, making Charles's plan seem impossibly wrong. "Mr. Charles, this is not right. Your children, they deserve your money. I am just the maid. I clean your house, I cook your food, but I am not your family." But Charles had been insistent, explaining his reasoning with the same methodical thoroughness that had made him successful in business. He had seen how his children treated money as an entitlement rather than a responsibility, how they had never learned to value work or appreciate sacrifice. Now Elena faced the terrifying prospect of inheriting wealth beyond her comprehension, while watching the family she had served for 27 years tear itself apart in response to Charles's decision. She could hear Thomas's angry voice and the stunned silence that followed Harold's revelations, could imagine the shock and rage that must be consuming people she had cared about, despite their flaws and limitations. Chapter 16. The Family Torn. The revelation of Charles Whitmore's will had created fractures in the family that seemed to spread and deepen with each passing hour, turning the oak-paneled study into a battlefield where decades of suppressed resentments finally found their voice. Margaret had recovered enough from her initial shock to join Thomas in his rage, though her anger manifested in cold, calculated phrases rather than his hot fury. "This is clearly the result of undue influence," she declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in boardrooms and committee meetings. A woman in Elena's position, with daily access to a vulnerable elderly man, could easily manipulate him into making decisions against his own interests and those of his family. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, transforming the study's atmosphere from shocked confusion to something approaching warfare. Sarah found herself in the unexpected position of defending someone she had barely considered as more than a fixture of her grandfather's household. "Elena has worked for this family for 27 years, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the emotional chaos around her. "She's never asked for anything beyond her salary, never pushed herself forward, or tried to insert herself into family business. How can you accuse her of manipulation when she's the one person who's been consistently loyal and helpful?" Elizabeth, who had remained silent through most of the afternoon's revelations, finally spoke up with a perspective that surprised everyone. "Maybe Dad knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe he looked around and realized that the person who actually cared about his well-being, who treated him with genuine kindness rather than obligation, wasn't one of us." Her words carried a weight of self-recognition that made them even more devastating than Thomas's anger or Margaret's accusations. The grandchildren watched this adult conflict with growing alarm, their own futures suddenly uncertain as they began to understand that the family structure they had always taken for granted was collapsing around them. The study that had once seemed like the solid center of the Whitmore legacy now felt like the epicenter of an earthquake that would reshape their family forever. Chapter 17. The Court Battle. The legal challenge to Charles Whitmore's will began before Harold Pemberton had even finished reading the document's final provisions, with Thomas contacting his own attorney from his cell phone while still standing in his father's study. The next 6 months would prove to be among the most contentious probate battles in the county's recent history, with teams of lawyers dissecting every aspect of Charles's mental capacity, Elena's relationship with the family, and the circumstances surrounding the will's creation. Thomas hired Preston, Morgan and Associates, the most aggressive litigation firm in the state, while Margaret engaged her own legal team to pursue a separate challenge based on claims of elder abuse and undue influence. The media attention was immediate and intense, with the story of the millionaire who left everything to his maid, capturing public imagination and dividing opinion along predictable lines. Elena found herself thrust into a spotlight she had spent her entire adult life avoiding. Her every move scrutinized by reporters and private investigators hired by the Whitmore legal team. Her daughter Maria, now completing her final year of nursing school, was forced to endure questions about her mother's motives and methods. The legal proceedings dragged on through depositions, expert testimony about Charles's mental state, and exhaustive examination of household staff, neighbors, and business associates. Harold Pemberton found himself in the difficult position of defending his friend's final wishes while being portrayed by opposing counsel as either complicit in Eleanor's supposed manipulation or negligent in his duties as Charles's attorney. Chapter 18. The Father's Confession. The breakthrough in the legal case came from an unexpected source, a private journal that Harold Pemberton had discovered among Charles Whitmore's personal effects, locked away in a desk drawer that had apparently been overlooked during the family's initial cataloging of his possessions. The journal, written in Charles's distinctive handwriting and spanning the final 2 years of his life, provided a window into his evolving thoughts about family, legacy, and the true meaning of inheritance. The entries began simply enough, recording Charles's daily activities and business concerns, but gradually evolved into something approaching a confession, a brutally honest examination of his relationships with his children and his growing awareness of who had truly been there for him during his declining years. One entry, dated just 6 months before his death, was particularly revealing. I watched Elena with Thomas's boy Michael today, helping him with his homework, while Thomas worked late again, just as I used to do when Thomas was a child. She showed him the same patience, the same genuine interest that she shows me every day. Another entry revealed Charles's growing disillusionment. Margaret spent the entire evening complaining about the staff at her country club, treating Elena like she was invisible, even though Elena had spent all day preparing her favorite meal. Only Elena asked about my doctor's appointment. Only Elena noticed that I was tired and suggested I rest. The most damning entry came from Charles's final month. I told Elena today about my decision regarding the will, and her first response was to beg me to reconsider, to think about my family's feelings. She was genuinely distressed at the thought of causing them pain, even though they have never shown her the same consideration. This is exactly why I know I'm making the right choice. The journal entries effectively demolished the legal challenges based on diminished capacity or undue influence. They revealed a man who was not only mentally sharp, but deeply thoughtful about his decision. someone who had spent months observing and analyzing the character of everyone around him before reaching his final conclusion. Chapter 19. The Maid's Choice. When the legal challenges finally collapsed under the weight of Charles's own written testimony, Elena Rodriguez found herself facing a choice she had never imagined having to make. The Whitmore fortune was legally hers, all $23 million of it, along with the estate, the business holdings, and the responsibility for deciding what to do with a legacy that had taken Charles Whitmore a lifetime to build. But wealth, Elena discovered, was not the liberation that outsiders imagined it to be. Instead, it felt like a burden almost too heavy to bear, especially when it came at the cost of relationships with people she had served and cared about for nearly 3 decades. The Whitmore children had made their feelings clear through their lawyers and through the media campaign, and none of them had spoken to her directly since the will reading. Elena found herself living alone in the vast estate that had once been filled with family gatherings and the comfortable routine of serving others. Her daughter Maria had taken a leave of absence from nursing school to help her mother navigate the complex legal and financial decisions that came with sudden wealth. But even Maria seemed overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had happened. After months of sleepless nights and careful consideration, Elena made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She would keep the estate and enough money to secure her daughter's future and her own comfortable retirement. But the rest would go toward creating something entirely new. Working with Harold Pemberton, Eleanor established the Charles Whitmore Foundation for Working Families, dedicated to providing educational scholarships, emergency assistance, and small business loans to people like herself. But perhaps most significantly, Elena made a personal offer to each of the Whitmore children. She invited them to join the foundation's board of directors to help shape how Charles's wealth would be used to honor his memory and values. The invitation was extended without conditions or expectations, simply as an opportunity for them to transform their bitterness into something productive and meaningful. Chapter 20. The Legacy Preserved. The response to Elena's invitation was mixed, reflecting the complex emotions that continued to swirl around the Whitmore family, even a year after Charles's death. Elizabeth was the first to accept, perhaps because she had been the least invested in the family business, and therefore felt less personally betrayed by her father's decision. She brought to the foundation board her extensive travel experience and cultural knowledge, helping to design programs that would serve diverse immigrant communities with sensitivity and respect. Thomas initially refused, his pride still too wounded to accept what he saw as charity from someone he continued to view as an outsider. But as months passed and he watched the foundation's work begin to make a real difference in people's lives, he found his anger slowly transforming into something approaching curiosity. Eventually, Thomas joined the board as well, bringing his business acumen to bear on questions of financial sustainability and program effectiveness. Margaret remained the holdout, unable to overcome her sense of social embarrassment and personal betrayal. But even she began to soften as she watched her children, Sarah and Michael, become involved in the foundation's work. Sarah had thrown herself into the scholarship program with the passion of someone who had finally found meaningful work, while Michael had discovered that his business school education could be applied to helping small entrepreneurs. The foundation became, in many ways, the family that Charles had always hoped his children would become, united by shared values rather than shared blood, committed to using resources to help others rather than simply accumulating wealth. Elena found herself at the center of this transformed family, no longer the invisible servant, but the acknowledged leader of an enterprise that honored Charles's memory in ways that simply inheriting money never could have achieved. The physical transformation of the Whitmore estate reflected the spiritual transformation of the family it had housed for so many years. Eleanor had converted several of the unused bedrooms into office space for the foundation staff, while preserving Charles's study exactly as he had left it. On the desk, Eleanor had placed a framed copy of Charles's final journal entry. "I have spent my life building a fortune, but only in my final years have I learned the difference between wealth and riches. Wealth is what you accumulate, but riches are what you give away." Chapter 21. Reflections. As Elena sat in Charles's old chair 5 years after that shocking afternoon in the study, she often wondered what her employer and friend would think of what his final decision had accomplished. The Charles Whitmore Foundation had grown into one of the region's most respected charitable organizations. More than 2,000 students had received scholarships. Hundreds of small businesses had been launched with foundation loans, and countless families had been helped through emergencies. Thomas had become the foundation's most effective advocate in the business community, using his connections and credibility to leverage additional resources. His relationship with his son, Michael, had been rebuilt through their shared commitment to the foundation's small business program, and Michael had eventually taken over day-to-day management of the family's original construction company. Margaret had never joined the foundation board, but she had quietly begun supporting its work through her social connections, organizing fundraising events, and recruiting other wealthy families to contribute. Elizabeth had surprised everyone by discovering a talent for grant-making that had given her life a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. Perhaps most remarkably, the bitter divisions that had seemed so permanent 5 years earlier had gradually healed, replaced by something that resembled the family Charles had always wanted his children to become. They gathered regularly now for foundation board meetings and family celebrations, but the dynamics were entirely different from the tense, competitive gatherings of the past. Elena had become the acknowledged matriarch of this reconstituted family, not through wealth or authority, but through the quiet leadership she had always possessed. The irony was not lost on any of them that Charles's most radical act, leaving his fortune to someone outside his bloodline, had ultimately brought his family closer together than they had ever been while he was alive. The Whitmore name, which had once been associated primarily with business success and personal wealth, had become synonymous with educational opportunity, community support, and the belief that everyone deserved a chance to build a better life through honest work and determination. Chapter 22. Story lives on. The grandfather clock in Charles Whitmore's study kept time with a steady kindness, its measured ticking outlasting quarrels, verdicts, and the noisy seasons of grief. The house had changed. Rooms once closed were open to new footsteps, and the long table where expectations fractured now hosted plans for scholarships and second chances. In framed photos along the corridor, faces once hard with pride were softer, as if practice in giving had taught them how to recognize what could never be purchased. Elena still preferred the quiet hours, the ones before dawn when the estate held its breath and the garden lights faded into a patient gray. She would sit at the desk Charles had loved, read the letters from students and families, and think of the day a sealed envelope remapped a family's heart. Wealth had not disappeared. It had been translated into tuition receipts, lease deposits, seed capital, and thank you notes written in careful hands. In that translation, the Whitmore name had learned a new grammar, not possession, but purpose. Sometimes she spoke to Charles in the hush between minutes, telling him who had been helped this week, how Thomas argued eloquently for fiscal prudence and then voted to be generous, how Margaret, still careful with appearances, quietly made calls that opened doors, how Elizabeth's eye for hidden talent kept discovering lives on the verge of flowering. she would rest a palm on the old leather blotter and smile at how a will once read like a rupture now lived as a promise kept. The fortune had been divided. The family, slowly, had been made whole. Conclusion: the will that had seemed designed to divide had ultimately united. The inheritance that looked like punishment had redeemed, and the family broken by expectation had been mended by love, freely given and humbly received. What endured was not marble or money, but a practice of seeing the invisible and answering them with honor. Until we meet again in story, I wish you gentle dreams and quiet revelations.